Okay, so this is part 5 in our Bottom Agriculture Advanced course here in Coolanowle, Ireland. And the topic in this presentation is how plants grow. We know plants grow either well or they don't do so well. But that's pretty much where it ends. And it's not really clear, I think, in most people's minds, including when I was studying biology in the university, what the way in which plants grow. But let's take a look at this diagram here. Just looking at the root of the plant, you'll see here the woody interior of the root is called the xylem, and underneath the skin of the root is what's called, this is where the downward stream comes from the foliage of the plant, it's called the phloem. P-H-L-O-E-M. Now the plant takes up nutrients through the xylem and it gives off a stream of nutrition at the phloem. And the growing part of the plant, the live part of the plant's root, is the tip. And up here in the fixed part of the root is, you might say, the dead part of the root. So plants take up nutrients via their woody interior. This feeds cell division, chlorophyll production, photosynthesis in the tips and leaves where you build up sugars. Now each type of plant sends down a different mix of its surplus sap back to the root tips via the outer root layer just under the bark known as the phloem. These root exudates act as a food source for various microbes which elaborate nutrients from the clay humus complexes. They solubilize phosphorus, they fix nitrogen, they provide digestion and nutrient release. So what's going on in the soil is actually mineral release, nitrogen fixation, digestion, and nutrient uptake. What's going on, though, up in the canopy of the plant is photosynthesis, blossoming, fruiting, and ripening. A whole different pattern of activity. So the plant is relying on this dynamic interplay that's going on between what's happening below the surface of the soil and what's happening above. Now we've already talked about this to some extent, but that dynamic interplay needs to be as dynamic as possible in order to maximize plant growth. Actinomycetes are one of the big features. These are symbiotic microbes that grow out of the innermost tissues in the plant. They're not the plant, they're not the plant's DNA, they're what's called an endophyte. And this isn't fight like a boxing match. This is fight, P-H-Y-T-E. So it's an organism that lives within the tissues of the host plant. In this case, this picture here this is a bud on a ginger root. The ginger root was in the cellar over the winter, and this was the bud that started to grow out of it before it got planted. So what's happening here on the roots of this plant, you can see how strongly it has grown out right up close to the plant. So that's the older actinomycete activity, and as it goes down the root, the very tip of the root is virtually bare. You see this on several roots, and that's that white fuzz that's growing out of the root. That white fuzz is very delicate. So if you were to rinse this in a bath of salt water, then you see it disappear. It would just evaporate. So if you put salt fertilizer on the soil, then you'll do the same thing to it. And we're accustomed to thinking, oh, we need so much per hectare of this fertilizer. An NPK fertilizer, totally soluble. It's maybe got the salts of nitric acid or hydrochloric acid or sulfuric acid or phosphoric acid. So these are acids that are strong enough to burn the plant at a certain concentration. When you put that fertilizer on the surface of your pasture, let's say, and it rains and it dissolves and it works into the soil in the first inch, in the first 2.5 centimeters, it's 6 times as concentrated as it would be once it gets down 6 inches or 15 centimeters. So actually, the most important zone of the soil is the top inch or 2 inches in the soil. So what we're doing when we put that salt fertilizer on at the concentration that we are told to put it on is we're actually burning all those roots off in that top inch or 2. Because as it works down in the soil, it's 6 times as concentrated in the first inch as it's going to be once it goes down 6 inches. Is that clear? Salt fertilizers will kill off this kind of microbial activity in the soil because it's in that top couple inches that you get the most of this kind of activity. Now these fine hairs here, they're finer than rabbit fur. And you can imagine putting acid phosphate on the soil. It would be like taking a blowtorch in a hair salon. Just fries everything. So salt fertilizers are dangerous. If you have to use them, if you're used to using them, if you first mix them up with humic acid, then you will reduce that salinity because it will adhere to the humate molecules, and that will keep it from being a salt. It will now adhere to the humic acid molecules. And you'll reduce that salinity tremendously. So you put it out there, and you put it out there with something that holds on to it, and you don't have to put out as much. So if you were a conventional or are a conventional farmer, then right off, this should tell you that you should put out lower rates, and you should put it out with something that it will reduce its salinity and feed it to the soil food web. Now what we want to do with whatever our inputs are, we want to feed them to the soil biology, to the soil food web. And let the soil food web feed it to the plant. Because the plant is like your children. It needs to eat 3 times a day or more. You know, when I was a kid and I'd come home from school in the afternoon, Mom would give us some carrot sticks, maybe a banana or something over to tide us over to supper. Don't eat too much, dear. You'll spoil your supper. But she knew that it was like it's already been 4 hours since lunch. And it's going to be another 2 hours to dinner. So you have to have a little bit to tide you over, and the plants like that. And if we fed the plants like we feed our children, then we'd be feeding them several times a day. So it's nuts to be feeding plants once a month and to give them this great big hit. that makes them sick. You know, if you had to swallow all those salts, man, you'd have a sore throat, and you would be spewing out the rear end pretty quick. And so you'd be sick for the rest of the month. You get this really, really big blast, and then, oh boy, would you crash. And you'll see this if you're putting urea on your pastures. Those of you who might have seen this would have seen the hit of urea goes on and everything turns lush and green, and then 3 weeks later everything's a bit yellow. And if you go out in that pasture with the cow goes out there and tries to cut off the grass and it pulls it up. So you go by a pasture and it's got all these tufts of grass pulled up, you know what's happened. You burnt the roots off on your plants. Have you ever seen that? Or haven't you seen it? You know, who's a dairy farmer here? Only one? Two? Well, look, I saw a farm advertised in Dorrigo in Australia, and it said it's had monthly applications of urea. Well, boy, is that not a sales point. It shows you that the dairy farmer thought he was doing something good, but I know good and well that that's a sign of a sick farm. No wonder he was selling it. So this is the kind of thing that I think we have to be aware of. You can easily burn that off. Phosphorus solubilizers. One of the best phosphorus solubilizers out there is your vesicular arbuscular mycorrhiza. Now that's a complicated name, but you can see what it looks like here. You've got this whitish mass in the soil, and you've got these little white nodules. Those are the vesicles. The vesicles are the white blush, and the arbuscles are those nodules. But these are symbiotic fungi, and they live in connection with the plant's roots. The plant needs something that's out there in the soil, and the mycorrhiza say, oh, well, we've got it over there. So the plant's saying, well, okay, here, I'll trade you some sugar for some zinc. And this network of very fine tubes just sends it to the plant as though it's on the tube train, you know. It's going through the tunnels at 90 to nothing, and it arrives at the destination where it's needed. Now, this particular picture here was taken in a vineyard on Long Island, and I was looking at its compost row. This is a picture here that we call this plant in America lamb's quarters, but in Australia we call it fat hen. Do you know what plant I'm talking about? What do you call it here in Ireland? Lamb's quarters? Okay. Well, it's a real, cows will eat that one. It's a very nutritious plant. They won't like it if it's got too much nitrates, but this one here didn't have nitrates. It had plenty of silica, and the distance between the leaf nodes on this one was about just a little over a centimeter. So this particular plant, I spotted it. It was going to seed at no higher height than about the second rung on this stool. 2 feet off the ground, and it was making the last of its seed. And I thought, oh, I want to see what's going on the root of this plant. And that's when we pulled it up and we saw the mycorrhiza. Because that mycorrhiza was giving it silica, even though it's a phosphorus solubilizer, it was giving it plenty of silica, very nice tight leaf nodes, very, very dense plant. And that's the kind of compost you want to be putting on your fields. Now there's a number of different kinds of microbes that solubilize phosphorus. And that would be good to know here in Ireland because you've got plenty of phosphorus in most of the soils. So why isn't it available to your plants? Because your plants need this kind of microbial activity in the soil, and guess what? Humic acid feeds it. So where we've been putting humic acid on these dairy pastures, and we dig it up, we didn't see any in the pasture out there. But this is the kind of thing that will show up when you feed it. Nitrogen fixers. There's quite a number of nitrogen fixers that are phosphorus solubilizers. But your classic nitrogen fixers that everyone's aware of are forming nodules. This picture in the top left panel is nodules on soybeans. Okay, it's really nodulating to beat the band. But in that case, the rhizobia are being protected in those nodules by the soybean plant, and the soybean plant is feeding those rhizobia. It's feeding it calcium and other minerals, and it's feeding it sugars. So you get nitrogen fixation in the nodules. But an even more important source of nitrogen fixation are the azotobacters. So the azotobacter free fixes. It doesn't need a nodule. It just needs the soil as a whole to have what it needs in it. So once you've grown your legume and you've built the biological calcium levels in your soil, and you plant it, and you've got a grass that's putting down sugars, and your perennial rye out there in the pasture is a candy grass. It makes good sugar, and cows love it. It's sweet. But it's putting out its root exudates and feeding this kind of bacteria, the azotobacter. And here in Ireland, so far as I've seen in the soil samples that I've seen, the levels of available calcium are pretty good. There seems to be more of a problem here in getting available magnesium on your soil test. So maybe your azotobacter activity out here in the soil is really quite good. You look at this picture here, and you see this is a grass plant, and out here at the root tip there's no actinomycetes and no soil adhesion. But as you go backwards on the root, then the actinomycete activity gets thicker and thicker as you go back to the central stem, and the soil adhesion gets richer. And it's in that soil adhesion zone that you get your nitrogen fixation. It's fed by root exudation. So your grasses, which are much more efficient at photosynthesis than your legumes, see, all of your C4 plants, which are the best at making sugars, the most efficient sugar makers, they're all grasses. So they're the ones that are actually feeding the energy at much higher rates to the free-fixing azotobacter nitrogen fixers. And there's about a third of the nitrogen of the azotobacters that are also phosphorus solubilizers. Now we've got plants, we've got microbes, and we have animals. So in the plants, this is a picture of some maize that we were growing in Australia, and you can see the soybean blanket that's in between the maize plants. There in that left-hand panel, see how we've got a blanket of soybeans underneath the maize. Here the maize is growing. This received no nitrogen fertilizer. This is maize without any nitrogen fertilizer. Now you have your soil microbes that are working with the root exudates of both the soybeans and the corn plants. And there's a great diversity of microbial activity in the soil. Some of these are large and some of them are small critters. But most of these soil microbes are being eaten by something like your earthworms, could be your protozoa, could be mites or nematodes or whatever. And then the microorganisms that were digested by the soil animals are released as excreta from the soil animals, and that's what feeds the plants. So it's that biological diversity. Each plant is giving off a different kind of root exudate, and each one of those plants is hosting a different consortium of microbes. And then the animal life is going along and it's grazing, and it says, I think I'll go over here and have a bit of this, and then I think I'll go over there and have a bit of that. And so the animal is taking that diversity, and as a sort of a package, it's a system, it's giving that back to the plant as freshly digested amino acids. Here's some of the plants that I've found to be important. And in this first panel in the upper left, that plant down there is the pinto peanut that we were using as a ground cover in bananas, in avocados, macadamias. It could be practically any kind of plant. Citrus it worked really well with. Here in Ireland, I'm not sure what your orchard crops would be, but plums and apples maybe. But this is the kind of thing that you're looking for, is a deep-rooted legume that's going to make a ground cover. One of the best banana plantations I saw in Australia had a pinto peanut ground cover, and they turned the sheep in there periodically to graze it off. They never mowed it. And the banana plants were big enough the sheep didn't graze them. But it's a biodynamic banana plantation, and it was going great guns with no fertilizer. Because what was fertilizing it was the ground cover. In my bananas in Australia, I grew sweet potatoes as the ground cover. And that created enough food for the soil animal life that they fertilized, that they fed the bananas.
So what's the best ground cover here?
It's a good question, and you might have to have an annual. You might have to have an annual legume, and summer annual, winter annual. So you might have to rotate your ground covers. I'm not really sure what your best ground cover would be, but this is the principle: is to grow something there that feeds your orchard, feeds your plants. Bamboo is like the classic amongst silica plants, a very fast-growing, enduring, like silica plant. Kudzu, which we mentioned earlier, is a fast-growing leguminous plant. You can't keep kudzu alive in a pasture. The animals will graze it to death. So if it's planted in amongst the canes of the bamboo, then if they can't reach it, they can't graze it, and it'll go out the top and stream over the sides, and then they'll eat it where they can get it.
And there are people that plant it as a fodder plant.
It's a great fodder plant. Boy, is it a great fodder plant. Now, oak bark, for instance, is, we discussed this previously, how oak bark is the basis of one of our biodynamic preparations. And this works with calcium, and it also works with silicon. and it keeps nitrogen in the amino acid phase. That's something we have to concentrate on, because when nitrogen gets in one of these soggy, waterlogged conditions and it oxidizes to the nitrate, then it carries our boron away, it carries our silicon away, it carries our calcium and sulfur away. So we want to keep nitrogen in the amino acid phase. And this preparation, the oak bark preparation, is crucial, especially under wet conditions. So, do you have wet conditions here? Yeah. So, you're going to want to use that oak bark preparation. Very important preparation for Ireland. Now, again, in the bottom left panel here, this is an Australian plant. You're not going to have this here. So, in your mind, substitute the horsetail for that one. But horsetail is a plant that would be growing here somewhere. Somebody can, yeah, you'd probably see it in the sandy or gravelier soils.
No, it grows I see horsetail, it grows in compacted, wet soil I know of the field, it grows in one area, that's compacted and wet.
Okay, this is a plant that in compacted soils, so it grows in a compacted wet area. In compacted wet soils, this plant can eat the silica out of the clay. And this is the kind of plant that relieves compaction because it's taking the silica out of that compacted clay. And it's able to provide silica in a situation where silica otherwise would be leaching away. So it loves silica. And if you were to harvest it, then it would be a great one to add to your composts. I found that I was unable to grow it in my pastures in Georgia because guess what? The cows couldn't get enough of it. So every time I planted it, and as soon as they got out and they got into the area with the horsetail, that was the end of it. So it's one of those things, it's the silica plant. The horsetail is the perfect complement to the oak bark. The yarrow plant, and we discussed with Mark's presentation, we discussed that yarrow has the best boundaries. It has the most finely divided leaf and has the most edge or boundary of any of the plants that we're using in biodynamics. And that boundary phenomenon, just incidentally, turned out to be crucial in weeding out the GMO genes in GMO contaminated crops. So that's one of the uses of this plant. But basically that's a sulfur potash plant. Then we see the stinging nettle, and the stinging nettle is the jack of all trades. It's like the center of the solar system, the sun. It represents the heart and the blood in the human body. And it's a terrifically nutritious plant. It's growing all along the laneways out here. So Jimmy has stinging nettle galore. Anybody who loses blood periodically needs to eat this plant. In both world wars in Europe, there would have been thousands and thousands of people die if they hadn't been eating this plant. It's not very easy to eat raw, but it's really good if you put it in a soup or a stew. Or I had it in India. I had it as they ground it into a paste. They ground it up as a paste, and it was really quite good, quite nutritious. Then dandelion. Dandelion is the best plant for the fruiting process. There's something about dandelion that it's capable of going from the root, the leaf whorl, directly into flower and fruit. It doesn't have to go up in a long stem like chicory. Chicory is a very close relative of dandelion, but chicory, when it blooms, it sends up a big long stalk and blooms at the height of the stalk. But dandelion blooms right in the leaf whorl. Now it gets its blooms up there above the grass in the spring. But if the grass is eaten off and the grass is low, then it blooms as low as the grass. And it has no obstructions. Okay? This is one of the problems the liver has, is the liver gets congested. And so the congestion is an obstruction. Well, dandelion is the herbal remedy for the liver. So dandelion can relieve obstructions. Look, you feed it to horses for colic. You could feed it to babies. Just make a dandelion tonic and put it in along with the baby's formula to deal with colic. Colic is an obstruction in the digestive tract. What it really is good for is when your apple tree blooms and the temperature is low, then it opens the doorway in the cell walls of the embryonic fruit and lets the calcium and amino acid into the cell for cell division. So when you use it at fruit set time, it could be apples, it could be grapes, it could be just about any fruit. It could be tomatoes. I've seen this work beautifully with tomatoes. You grow the little red cherry tomatoes here in Ireland? Well, you'll get the plumpest, fattest, shiniest little red cherry tomatoes. They'll set every blossom all the way to the end of the stem if you use this at the blossom set time. It's almost like magic. I was showing a friend of mine in Australia. I was growing tomatoes in the garden, and we went out and looked, and they'd been blooming, but they hadn't set any fruit. And I said, "Oh, I know what to do, Jeff. We'll give it dandelion preparation." We gave it the dandelion along with the valerian and the horsetail just by putting the radionic lead in the spray tank, filled it up with water, and gave it the patterns, and went out and sprayed it. And this was on Sunday. This is when we were off from work. So come back and we're looking at it on Thursday, and it set tomatoes all the way out to the end of the stem. That was 4 days. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. It set tomatoes all the way to the end of the stem in 4 days. He said, "I wouldn't have believed it if I hadn't seen it." It was like magic. And this is the basis of that preparation. This preparation is actually sewn up in a cow's mesentery. The mesentery is with a cow, the mesentery is that membrane that holds the guts up in the abdominal cavity. The abdominal cavity is big in a cow, but from the top of the abdominal cavity, that peritoneum comes down around the small intestine, and it's a fatty tissue about this long or wide that holds it up. You can imagine what would happen to a cow if its small intestine fell down to the bottom of its abdomen. The cow wouldn't be very successful. So this is the membrane. You take that membrane when you kill a cow, you take that membrane off, you cut it out of the top of the abdominal cavity and cut it off the small intestine, and peel that open and stuff it full of dandelion flowers. I pick the dandelion flowers and dry them. Then when I'm using it, I make a little tea with a few of them and moisten the rest. And then I stuff them in there and sew it up with boot thread. And then I bury that in the soil. The animals in the soil would come and they'd eat it and take it away. So I take some nylon window screen and I make a pocket out of it. I fold it over and I staple it, and I put the cow's mesentery with the dandelion in it in that pocket, and then I staple up the top and I bury it in the fertile layer of the soil over the winter. And incidentally, it's not a bad idea to put a rock on top so the dogs don't dig it up and run off with the whole pouch. Dogs are pretty good at that. You know, they get attracted to your preparations when you bury them. And they're fascinated by these things. You know, there's elemental spirits come and occupy that preparation. There's things happen that we don't see with our eyes. And oh boy, the dogs have a field day with it. So if you want to find your preparation in the spring when it's time to dig it up, maybe 40 days after Easter, then you better protect it. But boy, does that make a brilliant preparation for setting fruit. Chamomile is the other side of that. That's what's at work around the roots of the plant. This chamomile flowers are sewn up in the cow's intestine. You take the small intestine and you strip the chyme out of it. It's got a slurry inside. It looks like a very loose pudding. You strip that out and you stuff the chamomile flowers, dried chamomile flowers in there with a sausage stuffing machine. Just like little sausages. And you sew them up in a pouch and you bury them in fertile soil over the winter. And they will work on the protozoal activity in the soil around the plant's roots and send the calcium and amino acid up through the plant to fill out, to go through that potassium cell wall that the dandelion preparation opens up, and it will drive the cell division in the embryonic fruit. So when you use the dandelion preparation, it's not going to work if you don't have calcium and amino acids coming up from the soil. So you use those two in tandem to get a good fruit crop. You get the early cell division in any fruit. If it's happening at a really good rate, then you'll get a nice fat fruit. You'll get a big apple. It'll be bright and shiny. It'll be solid to the core. So these preparations, mind you, it might seem a little bit strange what you're doing, but you're using the patterns of nature to get the activities that you want to work in your crop. So something to think about. It could be pumpkins that you're growing, you know, and you do the same kind of thing with them to get them to set fruit and to fill out and make a fat pumpkin. These are some of the kinds of microbes that are going on in the soil, symbiotic fungi and bacteria. So you've got your endophytic actinomycetes, you have your azotobacters. The azotobacters, when it gets dry, if it ever gets dry here, they sort of protect themselves up in these oocysts. So they form cysts. There's ectomycorrhiza too. They live only on the outsides of the plant's roots. And there's mycorrhizal fungi, your vesicular arbuscular mycorrhiza in all of these bottom three panels. And they are some of the real workhorses of the soil food web. Your digestion and your nutrient release is dependent on the animal activity in the soil. Now you've got animals in your environment. Don't tell me you're farming without animals. You might not have the cows, but how are you going to keep the earthworms or the bees out of your farm? Oh, I know. You can use enough poison where you get rid of them. But if you're not going to engage in a war on nature, then you can't keep these animals away. And they're the livestock of your farm, whether you're tending the beehive or not, or whether you're feeding the earthworms or not. It's pretty hard not to feed them. You know, when we dug out there, there were earthworms. There weren't the kind of earthworms I like to see in pasture. We should see a lot more of them. On the dairy farms where we had the earthworms really working and we did earthworm counts, we took all the earthworms out of what amounted to a cubic foot of soil and put them in a cup and weighed them. We had to kind of keep stuffing them back in the cup because they wanted to climb out. But we weighed them, and it turned out that we had 1.5 times as much earthworm flesh on the paddock as we had cows. So it's a big deal. You think cows digest the pasture? Man, earthworms, they clean it up. Everything the cows don't eat, the earthworms are dealing with. You look at this in the bottom panels, and there's several different kinds of things. Your protozoa, your dung beetles, your ants. You've got columboles. These are your little pill bugs, your centipedes, those kinds of things. Segmented arthropods. You have mites. You have nematodes. You look at this soil here, and boy, is it riddled with holes, most of which are so small you can't really see them, but some of which are quite large, must be earthworm holes or beetle holes or something of the sort. But this soil here, I can tell you, was really teeming with animal life. And when you see that kind of thing, the soil becomes crumbly. It becomes kind of like chocolate cake. This isn't quite dark enough for chocolate cake. Maybe it's ginger cake. But you get the carbon built up in your soil, and it's going to look like a German chocolate cake. You can see a little bit closer up here in this picture what the soil looks like when it's really riddled with that whole spectrum of animal life. This sort of thing, when you get the animal life in your soil, you'll go walk on that pasture. The cows will step on the pasture and they will sink. It's like you'll feel like you're walking on a layer of foam. I had this happen on my farm, to where the verges of the road, they used to be hard as a brick, and the verges on the road became soft. In fact, what would happen when it rained, I'd go out there and here's the tracks of all the earthworms that were swimming around in the rain. You know, on the road. Good heavens, if that rained that night, if a bunch of people had driven up and down the road, they'd have smashed thousands of earthworms. Here was something I was talking about with ginger. Ginger, I find, is a fascinating crop, because in growing it biodynamically and growing it, I found that it didn't like compost mixed into the soil. But it's got 3 different kinds of roots. Look at these real fuzzy, like highly ramified roots, the thin ones. Those are its mineral uptake roots. But you see, of course, you've got your ginger, the storage root that you use as a condiment and food source. But look at the big thick roots that are coming down off of these this cluster of corms. These big thick roots, and you can't really see the end. You see the little bit of the end of this one. It's pointed and it's slightly swollen. So these ones that are out of the picture have a little bit bigger bulblet on the tip. But these go straight down or nearly straight, and they're your nitrogen fixing roots. This is a better nitrogen fixing plant than clover or soybeans. So, and look at the soil. That really is chocolate cake. So what's happened with this ginger is it started out growing slow, and it kept growing faster and faster, and you see the distance in the leaf nodes, the nodes on the storage root, that it got to the point that it was really quite a distance. And that's a really good sign of healthy biological activity around the roots. So ginger, I found, was a really good plant to get the soil biology working. This is a picture of ginger. Like, I just dug this patch of ginger, and look at it. Here's the amount of ginger I got out of this amount of area. I don't know what ginger's going for in your store here, but I'm sure that this would be a profitable crop if you could grow it. And if it's grown in Canada, maybe it could be grown in Ireland. So, and this stack here was the bits that I planted. These were the bits that I harvested along the road. But this little pile out front were the bits that I harvested, and this pile off to the right was the stack of material that I was hauling to the compost pile from there. So, on a small scale, I found ginger to be the best crop for waking up the soil biology and getting paid for it. I have to get, I was the kind of farmer that I didn't have a subsidy, and I had to get paid for what I did. If I'd have had a subsidy, I'd have to do what they told me to do. But since I was independent and didn't have a subsidy, I could do what I wanted to do. And I think that says something about subsidies. This was what the soil looked like after growing ginger. When I dug the ginger, this is what the soil looked like. Look at how crumbly, how dark. And look at the earthworms. I mean, holy smokes. These were the ones that didn't get to hide before I got my camera. So, really what we're doing here is growing the soil into fertility. Wouldn't that be a good idea? You could grow your soil into fertility. And this isn't the only way. I mean, maybe you can't grow ginger in Ireland, but maybe you can. But there'd be something that you could grow that would grow your soil into fertility. One of the things I'm using currently, because I'm going from winter to winter, is I'm using garlic for this. Garlic will grow your soil into fertility. Maybe we can talk about that in our discussion. This is a picture. This was on a school farm down in Melbourne. And I always like to see, this is a variety of clover, incidentally, that you rarely ever see make 4- and 5-leaf clovers. 4-leaf clover is a sign of a lucky farmer, right? It's a sign of good luck. Well, this farmer was making his luck because he had the soil biology cooking, and the cell division in his clover was going at such a clip that it was making 4- and 5-leaf clovers. It's like what was happening was the leaves were twinning in their embryonic stage. You know, when you see family, there's a bunch of twins in a family, that's a sign of fertility. We've had dairy farms that had lots of 4- and 5-leaf clovers, and this isn't the dairy farmer's happiest dream is to have twin calves. Especially if you've got Holstein cows, then they might not raise both calves. And if one of the calves is a male, then the other one, the female, will be a free martin. She'll never conceive. So it's not the dairy farmer's fondest dream. But it is a sign of fertility. And of course, if you've got sheep, you'll have triplets. So And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you really have consistent, rich soil fertility, they'll probably raise all three. So these are that's a sign, like I say, of a lucky farm. But let me tell you, the lucky farmers are usually making their own luck.